Okay, my name is Howard Eber, and I am an alcoholic. Um, Before we get started, there were quite a few things sent out in the email. Um, Actually, today, I sent it out earlier today. One of those handouts is something that we started to talk about last week. It's this doom curve. It looks like this, says doom curve at the top. And what I'm going to ask everybody to do is, if you printed it out, take the printout and do this. It is a nightmare. I worked so long on trying to get that fixed up. I could show you various copies of what it came down to. The bottom line is I'm gonna start over. We're gonna have this brand new one. So throw out the one you have because it's too confusing. And one other thing I want to put up, Andy, could you give me the recommended meetings? I've been asked to prepare a recommendation list of meetings, big book workshop style meetings like this that we recommend, that Kathy and I go to, that we have personal experience at, and we recommend. I know there are going to be people who are offended because I didn't put this person there or that person there, which is why I've stayed away from doing this, but I've been asked to do it. So every night of the week, you have a meeting that you can get to on Zoom that's like ours. It's not a big book speaker meeting. It's not a big book oriented meeting. It's not a big book discussion meeting. It is a big book study, just like ours. So you see, every night we have one, try to identify all of the people in it. You see, we go through Wednesday, there's a few meetings, and then on Thursday is our friend Steve Wood. On Fridays, a whole bunch of meetings. Paige and Terry, and a lot of people. On Saturdays, our friend Marianne. On Fridays, our friend Bill S. And of course, every night at 9 o'clock is the big book study. That is the only meeting that's not an actual study, but it's Bronx study, so it's a great meeting to go to. All right. So we've answered that question. I've got a list of meetings you could start with. It's just a suggestion. Okay, we are in Bill's story. Excuse me. And as we go through Bill's story, what I suggested is if you're like me, I read this story for 20 some odd years and I just couldn't identify with anything in it. I just could not identify with anything in Bill's life. And that was because I was comparing. So, what I'm going to suggest you do is not do that, not do what I did. Look for identification, points of identification. If we look for how Bill thinks, and we look for how Bill drinks, and we look for how Bill acts, every time we come across a point that you personally identify with, I'm going to suggest you put a pencil check mark next to it. And you'll be amazed by the end of this chapter how many pencil check marks you have. We're also going to take note and check off points of identification, not just points of identification, but points of his progression. Bill's progression, not just his descent into hell, which is what that doom curve was all about. And we'll make mention of those points as we go through them. But make notes of his progression in his drinking, how he started out to be drinking for fun. Moments sublime with intervals hilarious, drinking for fun. And then drinking ceased to be a luxury, it became a necessity. He was drinking to function. So we've gone from drinking for fun to drinking to function to drinking for the worst reason of all, the seeking of oblivion. And let's see if we could find those points and check them off. And I've also suggested that we make note of all the references that Bill makes to his quest for status, his quest for recognition, his quest for money, his big shotism. Bill walking around like he's Prince William of the Kingdom of Wilson, basically, is what we're talking about, this big shotism, and his use of hyperbole, his use of intentional exaggeration. Things aren't big, they're humongous. Always looking for status, always looking for recognition. And also, don't tell me I can't do something. We're going to check where we see Bill going into a situation because he's been challenged somehow. He's being told he can't do this, and that's the worst thing you could do to Bill Wilson. Say you can't do it. When he was a youngster, and he found an article about a boomerang that could be made by only the Aborigines in Australia, and his grandfather backed that up and said, "Oh, that's the truth, Bill." And Bill went about, okay, I'll show you, and he did. He built actually two boomerangs. They're now hanging on the mantle in his home in Katona, New York. We showed you the picture last week. I don't want to take more time about that now. Excuse me, but other things. He found a violin in the attic, and he said he's going to teach himself to play a violin, which his grandfather thought was preposterous, and he did. There's a whole lot throughout Bill's story, and we just came across one of those things in his business sense, where he had an idea of making money on the market, because at the time before the crash, it wasn't that hard to make money. You could put a little bit down on these cheap stocks and they would slowly go up. But Bill felt that was going to burst. That's a bubble that's not going to be sustainable. And he had an idea that I can go out, investigate these various companies that we're considering investing in, find out why they're not making as much money as they should. In other words, identify the problem within the company, and then come up with a solution. Let's think of how we can make this a profitable company. So we come up with a solution, and then we make a decision to implement that plan of action that produces results. The results are everybody's happy because everybody's making money, but it's also an indication of how Bill thinks. Identify a problem, identify a solution, make a decision to do something about it, implement a plan of action that produces results. Now, when Bill told that idea to his friends on Wall Street, they said, "No, we're not going to pay for you to gallivant all around the country on your motorcycle, having a vacation all year long. We're not going to do that to you, Bill." Don't tell Bill he can't do something. So he and Lois set out to do it and started investigating these companies and sending stuff back to New York. And all of a sudden, everybody's happy and everyone's making money. And they put Bill on the payroll because they don't want him to be giving that information to anybody else. But the point being, we told Bill said he wanted to do something. He was told it's ridiculous. You can't do it. He did it. And now everybody's following him to the tune of millions. And where we are today is we're on page 4. All of that said, all of that Michigas that we just went through leads us up to where we are on page 4. Excuse me, just to kind of highlight some of the points in his progression of drinking this descent into hell, this doom cycle. We started out where I'm saying, excuse me, where he said that he discovered what liquor could do for him, and he said he was very lonely and he turned to alcohol. That's one of the paths, one of the stops in this doom cycle. Later on, he points out, excuse me, that his judgment and ideas were followed by many to the tune of paper millions, but at the same time, and here's the step into doom, drinking was playing an important and exhilarating part of my life. Shortly thereafter, my drinking assumed more serious proportions and continuing all day and every night. Excuse me. At the bottom of page 3, before we get to page 4, where we're at now, Bill said, I began to be jittery in the morning. He's progressing. He's experiencing DTs. And on the top of page 4, paragraph 1, where we stopped last week, is when, as they say, the shit hit the fan. Abruptly in October 1929, hell broke loose on the New York Stock Exchange. The market crashed. Andy, if you'll start, let's go with 106A. The stock market crash of 1929. It was called Black Tuesday. It was October 29th. It was the start of the Great Depression. Within 2 months, investors had lost an estimated $40 billion. It took 27 years for the market to return to the pre-crash numbers. The market just dove, took a crash. Let's go to 106. Oh, yeah, here. People were leaping from buildings because a lot of people were buying stocks on margin, which means they were spending money that they didn't necessarily have. They'd call their broker, have them buy a certain amount of stock, take it out of an account. If the stock went up, they put the money back in the account. If the stock went down, they would call it in. That's what they called it. They'd call in the note, and the person would have to make up the difference. If they bought a stock at, say, $10 and it went down to $9, they'd have to make up that deficiency of $1 a share. But it wasn't jumping, it wasn't dropping by $1, it was dropping by fortunes. And people did not have the money to pay it in. So when the margin was called in, people didn't have it. And this is what was happening. People were jumping out of buildings on Wall Street, thinking their insurance will pay it, or they just don't have any way to make up that money difference. Excuse me, Andy. Let's go to the 106C. The headline from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle: Wall Street in panic as stocks crash. Let's go back to the reading, and then we'll come back to some of these illustrations. So it says, after one of the days of inferno, I wobbled from a hotel bar to a brokerage office. Anyone notice the order of things here? Most people go from the office to the bar, if that's what they're going to do. Bill starts out at the bar and winds up at the office. So I've got a check mark next to that. Got to be prepared before you go into work. It was 8 o'clock, 5 hours after the market closed. The ticker still clattered. I was staring at an inch of the tape, which bore the inscription XYZ negative 32. It had been 52 that morning. Excuse me, Andy, let's take a look at 4-1. The stock that he's talking about, this XYZ stock, was actually a stock, Andy, you'll get it up there in a minute, that's known as Penick Ford. That's a stock certificate from this company. Nothing special about the company, but that's what he's talking about. This stock had started today at a plus 52 value. By the end of the day, it was down to negative 32, which means the stock went down $84. So if you had purchased that stock for anything less than the $52 that it started with in the morning, you'd have to make up that difference, and people did not have the money. That's what we're talking about. These stocks just plummeted. All right, let's get back to the reading. And it had been 52 that morning. I was finished, and so were many friends. So there's the problem. The problem is the market went to shit, crashed. Here's the solution. The papers reported men jumping to their deaths from the towers of high finance. Did I skip a sentence there? Yes, I think I did. I was finished, and so were many friends. There's the problem. The papers reported men jumping to death from the towers of high finance. Please notice high finance is capitalized because to the men on Wall Street, that's their higher power. High finance, money, guilt. That disgusted me. And I think disgusted is a hyperbole. It's not just that it made him uneasy, it made him sick. He was disgusted at what these people were doing. I would not jump. And please highlight this. I went back to the bar. There's the solution. We start out with a problem. The market crashed. These notes are being called in. People are jumping out of windows. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? Bill says, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm going to go into the bar. Here's the solution. So he says, I went back to the bar. My friends had dropped several million since 10 o'clock. So what? So what? And that to me is an indication of this doom code as well, that he's not caring about what just happened. Tomorrow was another day, and please highlight this last sentence. As I drank, the old fierce determination to win came back. Liquid courage. Anyone ever have that experience? Something happens to you and you start having a few hits, and all of a sudden I'm going to show them and I'm going to get this and I'm going to do that. And the more we drink and the more we drug, the stronger and bigger our ego gets. Well, that's what's happening here. Um, in the dictionary of cliches, the the term liquid courage came from the term that was used at the time. It was called Dutch courage. I think people stopped using it because it was discriminatory, but it's just drinking and building courage from that point based on the chemical consumption. So next morning, I telephoned a friend in Montreal. He had plenty of money left and thought I'd better go to Canada. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. So he's back on top. He's arrived again. The market hadn't crashed that bad in Canada, so he went up to Canada, the place where he was working. His friend who called him, his guy's name was Richard Johnson. If you're thinking his name is Dick Johnson, you're right. That's the guy's name, is Dick Johnson. I can't make this stuff up. He was working for Green Shields, Greenshilds Company, Green Shields and Company Brokerage House. This was November of 1929. Bill went up to Canada to work for his friend Dick Johnson. By the following spring, we were living in our accustomed style. I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba. No St. Helena for me, and please highlight this, but drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. This time we stayed broke. Let's talk about that for a moment. For those of you, a bit of history here. Napoleon, he's talking about Napoleon, who was the Emperor of France in the early 19th century. He declared war on the European powers, British, Germany, Poland, Belgium, Russia, all these places that eventually became those companies. And he was defeated. He was defeated in 1813, and by 1814, he was exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, Elba. You see what he says? I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba, because what happened was they banished him to this island of Elba, but they let him take his army and they let him keep his title. So he was still considered the Emperor of Elba, and he still had an army with him on that island. So what do you think happened? Let's consider the options here. He came back. Oh, what a shock. What a shock. He came back. He was exiled to Elba, and he came back. And he came back and he got defeated again. And when he got defeated, Andy, you may want to put up this lovely picture 4-2. Here's a picture of our friend Napoleon Bonaparte. The picture shows him on that final destination of St. Helena, where he was exiled. There was a movie this past year that came out. It was a pretty long movie called Bonaparte, Napoleon, that told this whole story. If you're interested, whatchamacallit, Phoenix was in it. Was it Joaquin Phoenix? In any case, that's who Napoleon is. But this is the more important point here. If you could take that down, Andy. What he's saying here is, I felt like Napoleon returning from Elba, meaning He came back, vindication. That's what Elba represents in this particular reference. It's vindication. He came back from Elba. Everyone else was losing money. Bill came back. But he said, no St. Helena for me, meaning no final defeat, because that's what St. Helena represents. To Napoleon, he never came back from that. He was banished to St. Helena. He was exiled there without his army. He was left there basically by himself under 24-hour guard. He didn't last very long. He died there. But that was the last anyone heard of Napoleon Bonaparte. So the references here, just the significance of Elba and St. Helena, is one represents vindication, one represents total failure. He came back from Elba, vindicated, victory. Didn't come back from St. Helena, final defeat. That's the significance of this reference. Why did it happen? Well, we just read it. Drinking caught up with me again, and my generous friend had to let me go. He was wearing out his welcome. For the record, incidentally, the job there lasted 10 months. That's as long as he was able to hold it together. He went to work in Montreal in, like I said, November 1929. 10 months later, he was out. This time we stayed broke. We went to live with my wife's parents. I found a job, then lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. Let's do some real estate. Andy, if you could show me, let's start with 107. Bill and Lois went to live with her parents at 182 Clinton Street in Brooklyn. Her father was a physician, had a nice home. It's that one in the black box in the center. That's what it looks like today. But Bill and Lois went back to live there. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Having to live with his in-laws, and as you're about to see, all he did was stay home and drink, and Lois had to go out and work. But the point is, this is where he went to live with Lois, with their in-laws, okay? Just for the record, what this property is, this property still exists today. Obviously, it still exists. It is a very wealthy community where this now is. It's a gentrified community in Brooklyn. A few years back, I did some research, and as of 2008, it was being sold for, was it $3 million? But Kathy and I did some research, and you're welcome to do it yourself. Go to Zillow and put in the address 182 Clinton Street, and you could see that the property is now selling for $4.4 million. $4.5 million. And if you can't afford that, you could rent it.
What?
You could rent it for $28,000 a month. 28 grand. How's that for a monthly tab? Zillow is saying it's worth about 15,000. But these are pictures. What the person who owns the property now did is they rebuilt the top floor, which was Bill and Lois's home. That's where they lived, on the top floor. They rebuilt it, put a kitchen in it because there was none in there before. And this is what it looks like today. You could rent this property if you got that kind of money. But
Beautiful.
what it would be like to live in the apartment that Bill and Lois lived in. Wouldn't that be a trip? Okay. So that's the story of 182 Clinton Street. It's just, you can't afford to live in that neighborhood these days. I can't, that's for sure. Okay, so going back to what we were reading, he said, I found a job, lost it as a result of a brawl with a taxi driver. See, apparently, Bill was not an easygoing drunk. Bill was a difficult drunk. Bill got in fights, always coming home with his all beat up, cut up face, knuckles all cut up, black eyes, always coming home beat up because he would start fights all the time. And this is what happened here. He got into a fight with a taxi driver. No significance who that was at this point. Um, but he lost his job. Couldn't hold a job. He couldn't hold a job for a friend. Now he can't hold a job at all, period. So I put a big check mark next to that doom curve. He can't hold a job. Mercifully, no one would guess that I was to have no real employment for 5 years. Let's underline that, and let's underline or hardly draw a sober breath. These are the things that are going to be on that list when I get it done, of this doom curve, these descent, the indications of his descent into hell, on his way down. Couldn't stay sober, hardly draw a sober breath. My wife began to work in a department store, coming home exhausted to find me drunk. Let's underline that. That's what Bill is doing. He's staying at home in his in-laws' house while his wife goes out to work. Imagine the ego. I mean, nowadays, maybe it's okay to stay home and have your wife support you, but that's not what was going on here. Not in these days. And he wasn't just hanging out at home. He was drinking all day, all night. Incidentally, when it says my wife began to work in a department store, she was at that time working for Macy's in New York, in Manhattan. She was earning approximately $19 a week. I don't know how you pay any bills with that, but be that as it may, that in today's money, that's about $340, $350 a week. Not a lot of money. So she'd come home and find him drunk. I became an unwelcome hanger-on at brokerage places. He's no longer the knight in shining armor. He's going to the places that he made plenty of money for. A few pages ago, you remember when it said that people were following his words to the tunes of millions, taking what he suggested and doing it and making a fortune. So he'd go back to those companies thinking they would listen to him now. And he was dirty. He was loud. He was embarrassing. And they're saying, Bill, please leave. We don't want to call the police on you here, but you got to get out of here. You're disrupting the whole business. Go do something about your life. So he was no longer welcome there. Please highlight the next sentence. Liquor ceased to be a luxury. It became a necessity. Underline as well, if you wouldn't mind, the word luxury and the word necessity. Luxury is something that's excessive. Necessity is something that's required. So he is now not just a heavy drinker. He's deep into that second stage, drinking for necessity, drinking to function. Sometimes a small deal would net a few $100. And what do you think he does? Go home and say, Lois, here's a few bucks, pay the phone bill. Let's go do some food shopping, put some food on the table, maybe buy dinner for your parents. Doesn't do any of that stuff. What does he do? I would pay my bills at the bars and delicatessens. Now, as far as I can tell, his priorities are in order, because what is important to Bill at this time? He needs to be able to have income so he could buy his liquor. Paying the rent doesn't enter into the picture. In terms of necessity for Bill Wilson, his top priority, number one, me. Me, me, me. My drinking, my needs, my wants. He doesn't kick in anything. Imagine what that's like to his ego. Huge humiliation. He gets a few bucks And he knows what it would be like to give that to his wife, but he doesn't even give it a thought. He uses it to pay a tab at that bar because he's going to need to borrow on that money again later. Can't have that run out. This went on endlessly, and I began to waken very early in the morning, and please underline shaking violently. He's having the DTs. And again, this whole section that we're reading now, this is all part of that doom curve, his descent into hell. He went on endlessly. He said, morning shaking violently, a tumbler full of gin followed by a half a dozen bottles of beer would be required if I were to eat any breakfast. Hell, that was breakfast. But please notice also required. Required is a way of saying must. And one of the things we do in the workshop here is we highlight all of the musts. People say there are no musts in AA, but there's a crap load of them in the book. So we highlight them and we use green as an arbitrary color. I'm sure one of the people will put it in the chat, the color codes that we were using. Green is for must, pink is for promises and prayers. We have recovered references in orange and approach references in blue. Anything else, yellow is fine. But okay, let's get back to the book. Would be required for her to eat any breakfast. And please highlight this. Nevertheless, I still thought I could control the situation. Let's turn the clock back to the beginning of the book, in the doctor's opinion, where he says that we begin to be unable to differentiate the true from the false. Bill can't tell the difference between the truth and the false. He still thinks he can control it. He's saying it's not a luxury, it's a necessity. He's saying he drinks day and night. It's never ending. Nevertheless, I still thought I can control the situation. And I've got a big one of those pencil marks next to that, check marks next to that, tick marks next to that. Because no matter what was going on, I always thought if I can get a little bit more of that, the thing that's causing those problems, I'd figure out a way to deal with this. That's what he's dealing with now. The insanity. And there were periods of sobriety which renewed my wife's hope. So he thought he could control the situation. We can clearly see that he cannot. So he thinks he can control the situation, right? Let's see how self-control worked. Please highlight the next 3 lines. Gradually, things got worse. And let's underline that as well as highlighting it. The house was taken over by the mortgage company. My mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. So everything's coming up roses for Bill, right? Not a cloud on the horizon. Well, let's take a look at what's going on here. Lois's father defaulted on the mortgage after his wife passed away. And this was during the Depression, during the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And they had laws passed that the bank couldn't just take your home if you couldn't afford to pay it. There was a way to pay a certain amount in a fee or rent, if you will, each month so that you could continue to live where you were living. But that's what happened here is the bank has now taken over the mortgage and they're paying whatever fee they have to pay to continue to live there. He remarried. Lois's father remarried. And what did he do? He moved out. He moved out of the house. So now, whatever that fee is, that overhead, that rent that they have to pay to the bank, which was in large part being paid by Lois's father, he's out of the picture. It's now Lois and Bill, or just Lois, as it turns out, who is having to pay these bills. We know how that's going to end. So, uh, and he also mentions my mother-in-law died. My wife and father-in-law became ill. Lois had three, I believe is the number, ectopic pregnancies during this period of time. People ask why Bill and Lois didn't have any kids. They tried, they could not. She damn near died during this time period from those things. And according to, I think it's in Francis Hartigan's biography of Bill, he mentions that in all three of those hospitalizations, Bill showed up at the hospital once. It eats into drinking time. There's no time to be pleasant and go show my respects to my wife. I got some serious drinking to do here. I can't be timed. What am I going to do there? What am I going to do there? I can't do any drinking in the hospital. So he didn't even go visit her. And incidentally, if you're interested in the rest of that story, they did try and adopt. Um, Years after Bill passed away, Lois did some investigating and found that the agency that they were working with actually found them a child to adopt. But one of the references that Bill and Lois gave them told them the truth, told them the situation you're bringing this child into is not a very healthy place. All he does is drink. The man's got an alcohol problem. This is not the place to be bringing up a child. So without knowing it, Bill's drinking cost them the possibility of having a child. Bill didn't know that. Lois found it out after he passed away. Then I got a promising business opportunity. Stocks were at a low point of 1932, and I had somehow formed a group to buy. I was to share generously in the profits. Then I went on a prodigious bender, and the chance vanished. I was to share generously, again, hyperbole, generously. And I didn't just go on a bender, I went on a prodigious bender. And what this is the famous Jersey Lightning story. Bill had an opportunity. Some of the guys he used to work with had an opportunity to present to him that they felt would be perfect for him, but they knew he was drinking. So they made a deal with him and they put it in writing, a contract that said that if he was successful in putting this deal together, he would be heading up this company and he'd be making more money than he ever imagined before. But if he drank so much as once, it was over. And Bill managed to stay sober for a little while until something happened. And I'm going to show you what happened. Sorry, I can't get this to play here. Let me try it again. This may be somewhat familiar to some of you. I'm really sorry this is taking so long.
Founder of the founder. And I fell into a conversation. Was empowered
There you go.
to bring to the world
What I wanted to show you begins here.
this fellowship, this message. But I think, like any gift of this magnitude, simply for to protect him, he was not granted the full knowledge of what the price would be.
He was spellbinding on his own story anytime I ever heard him. And I think everybody else had that same sense. Because I think what people realized they were listening to was the founding myth, I guess, would be, it's not myth, it's reality, simply a story of a founding. And that's what this was. And it was endlessly wanted and effective.
Some of you people may ask, why do these drunks continue to drink in the face of certain destruction? Why can't they stop? Well, this story will illustrate. One day I was sitting in a brokerage shop, and I fell into a conversation with a man who proved to be an heir to a great fortune. And I began my sales talk on how cheap securities were, how a syndicate ought to be put together to gather these things up. And he fell in with the idea. And I was to be the manager. Moreover, I was to have a third interest. Well, by the time we got that far in the conversations, they discovered about my drinking. So they came to me and they said, look, Bill, we know you got a real liquor problem. Would you be willing during the life of this thing to sign an agreement that you will not drink? That if you do drink, your interest in it will be ended. You know, the curious thing is, I really believed that I could stay sober when the incentive was so great. And money came in, we began to buy securities, but now see what happened. One day, some old business acquaintances called me up. They said, Bill, we hear you're sober. They said, well, won't you go over in Jersey and do a piece of work for us? I said, sure. That evening, we put up at a small hotel, and one of the boys brings out a jug. And I said, well, what you got there? Why, they say that's Applejack, Jersey Lightning. No, thanks. No, I'm not drinking. I can't handle it. They fall to playing cards. Every now and then the jug comes my way. With ease, I say, no thanks, because I can see my name on that contract. So quite easily I say no, until about 10:30 perhaps. Something occurred within me. And if that could be ever fully explained, we would completely comprehend the mystery of this obsession of drinking. Why, Bill Wilson, in all your drinking, Europe and sense, never in all your life have you had any Applejack. Not one single drink of Jersey Lightning. That idea began to take hold and possess me, so that when that jug was passed to me, a curtain had fallen between me and reality. So I said, thanks very much. I will have one little shot this time. It couldn't hurt me at all. I lay in that hotel drunk for 3 days. That, I submit, is not the habit of drinking. That is the obsession of drinking. That obsession that has condemned people like us, time out of mind, to insanity and death.
You may all remember that from the Bill W. documentary we saw a few weeks back, but I love that story. I mean, there's so many statements he makes in that, you know. He said, I thought I could stay sober when the incentive was so great. Can anyone identify with that? The incentive was so great. I got it down. I can do this. And then he says, a curtain had fallen between me and reality, between me and the truth. He said, I actually thought I could do it when the incentive was so great. Well, that's the story we just heard. We're reading about here, that he had this opportunity and he went on this prodigious bender and the chance vanished. We're back to page 5, paragraph 4 that begins with, I woke up. I woke up. This had to be stopped. And please highlight this next sentence. I saw I could not take so much as one drink. I was through forever. So he has a moment of clarity. Can anyone identify with that? You know, you made a commitment, yeah, and we're going to stick to it, and yeah, staying sober when the what do you call it? The incentive was so great is an inadequate higher power. Fear is an inadequate higher power. Self-knowledge, we're about to see, is an inadequate higher power. And Bill is seeing that self-control is not adequate either. So he says, I was through forever. Before then, I had written lots of sweet promises, but my wife happily observed that this time I meant business. And so I did. So Bill trotted out your good old willpower and says, come on, Will, we're going to take care of this. We're going to hunker down and we're not going to drink. Lois, get me out that family Bible. I'm going to write it in the Bible so you know how serious I am. And Andy, if you can give me that picture. I think it's 111. This is actually from Lois's family Bible. The Bible sits in Stepping Stones, the house that Bill and Lois lived in Katona, New York. And this is what Bill wrote as he was going through the, and that's, like I said, you can see this in the, in a case in Katona, New York, at Bill and Lois's home at Stepping Stones. He said, to my beloved wife that has endured so much, let this stand as evidence of my pledge to you that I have finished with drink forever. October 20th, 1928, Bill. It's a good thing he started out at the top of the page. If you'd have written it in the center of the page, you wouldn't have had room to write the rest of this. You think he knew what was going to happen? That's October 20th. On Thanksgiving Day, 1928, that's 1 month later, he writes, my strength is renewed 1,000-fold in my love for you. 1 month he managed to stay sober, self-control. That's Thanksgiving Day, 1928. To tell you once more that I am finished with it, I love you forever on January 12th, 1929. Actually made a few months before he made another solemn pledge on that. And from January 1929 to September of 30, he said, finally, and for a lifetime, thank God for your love. He swore off again. You could take that down, Andy. Anyone ever make any solemn pledges like that? Right? I'll put it in writing. That's how damn serious I am. Or I'll swear on the heads of my children or all of this other nonsense. Can anyone identify with that? Well, I got a big check mark next to it. That's for sure. Absolutely. So he said, but my wife happily observed this time I'm in business, and so I did. Shortly after, I came home drunk. There had been no fight. Let's highlight those two sentences. No defense. We're going to read later, we are without defense against that first drink. But shortly after declaring he was done forever, he came home drunk. And you know I got a big check mark next to that. Talking about the way Bill thinks and the way Bill acts. I don't care what he did in his life, but I did those same things. The experiences that he went through may have ended up in different life circumstances, but I did all of these things countless times. Remember, in Doctor's opinion, frothy emotional appeals seldom suffices. Frothy emotional appeals is another insufficient higher power. Swearing on the Bible. Being told what I'm doing to my dad had me slow down for a while. And when things got real quiet, I went right back to what I was doing before. A frothy emotional appeal, self-knowledge, self-control. Someone's asking me to go over the inadequate higher power list. It's simple. Let's start with self-control, self-knowledge, fear. Fear is an inadequate higher power. You can stay sober on fear for a while. An incentive like he had with this business. Good incentives, good intentions, not inadequate higher power. These are just some examples. We're going to run into some more in a little bit longer. We're going to see that self-knowledge, because Bill's going to find out shortly what was wrong with him. And he thought, now that I know what the problem is, everything will be okay. And that was not the case. So there's a lot of inadequate higher powers here. Staying sober for somebody else is an inadequate higher power. We're going to come into some more of them. We'll mention them as we do. So he says, there had been no fight. Where had been my high resolve? What is high resolve? Willpower. Willpower. An inadequate higher power. I simply didn't know. It hadn't even come to mind. Someone pushed a drink my way and I had taken it. Please highlight the rest of this paragraph. Was I so crazy? I began to wonder for such an appalling lack of perspective seemed near being just that. You may want to underline appalling lack of perspective. It's a wonderful definition of insanity. An appalling lack of perspective. I'm unable to distinguish the real from the false, from the truth from the lie. An appalling lack of perspective. Now he's doubting his sanity. One of the things when I go through this book with prospects, with sponsees, we always stop at certain points and I ask them about their experience. And at this point, I ask them that. Do you ever recall doubting your sanity? All those other points, you ever make a solemn vow? But here's an example of one of those questions. Have you ever doubted your sanity? Thinking I could control anything I set my mind to, I could get a handle on, I could control it, I could achieve it. Why can't I do this? I must be insane. We doubt our sanity. Renewing my resolve. Let's get willpower out. Let's drag out will, dust off the willpower machine. We're going to try again. Renewing my resolve. Highlight this, please. I tried again. Some time passed, and confidence began to be replaced by cocksuredness. There's a reference to hyperbole, cocksuredness. He's overconfident. Overconfidence is an inadequate higher power. I could laugh at the gin mills. Now I had what it takes. One day I walked into a cafe to telephone. Please highlight, in no time, I was beating on the bar, asking myself how it happened. How did it happen? Let's take a look at the situation. How did that happen? What just this situation he's describing? What happened? He's asking himself what happened. So let's go through it. What happened? He walks into his bar. Why did he go in there? To use the telephone, right? The mental obsession is already starting to take hold. He's about to do something based on a lie. The lie is that he can go into that bar and just make that phone call. Once he gets in the bar, you know, the first thing he thought, I could have one. I'm not going to hurt. I could have just one. What happened? I just went to the bar to make a phone call. I'm just in the bar and I'll have just one drink. That's all, just one drink. That's all. I'm going to have that one drink. And he takes that one drink, and what happens? The allergy kicks in. The obsession is blown away. The allergy kicks in. The craving takes over. The phenomenon of craving takes over. Now that it's in him, all he wants is more and more and more. And what happens? He ends up drinking against his will. Anyone here ever drank against your will? Now, when you pose a question like that, you may think, no, I never drank against my will. Let's go back through the story. Just go in someplace. Maybe just use a phone. I'm in there. I'm just going to have one drink. That's all, just one drink. It won't be no big deal. Next thing I know, I'm out in an alleyway somewhere with one shoe and a black eye. How did that happen? How the hell did that happen? We drink against our will. Next paragraph, the remorse. Let's underline remorse. Horror. Let's underline horror. Hopelessness. Let's underline hopelessness. And the next morning are unforgettable. Let's highlight that whole sentence, as well as the next 3 lines. This is a magnificent description of a spiritual malady, description of the 4 horsemen. But really what he's describing here are the DTs. And on the left side of this margin of the page, in the margin, I've written mourning, terror, and madness. He's experiencing DTs. What we in the street used to call jonesing. He's jonesing. He's craving it, and it isn't even in his system yet. He's past that point. He said the courage to do battle was not there. And please underline, my brain raced uncontrollably. Big check marks next to every one of these sentences, these phrases. And there was a terrible sense of impending calamity. Can anyone identify with that? Coming to, forget about waking up. We're not waking up, coming to the next morning. And all we feel is remorse and horror and hopelessness. We don't have any ability to do any battle to fight this thing anymore. Our brain is racing. Can't identify any thoughts. The screaming of 1,000 monkeys in our head. And there's that feeling of impending calamity. All you could think of is disaster and disaster and disaster. And again, please, next to that, these 4 lines, write mourning, terror, and madness. And I'll explain why when we get to the end of the paragraph. I hardly dared cross the street lest I collapse and be run down by an early morning truck, for it was scarcely daylight. Here's a great example of Bill's downward spiral. He's becoming less and less responsible. He's like a child now. He's more a child than he is an adult. He can't even cross the street. He's like a little child at this point. He's afraid. What happened to Big Willie? What happened to King Bill of Wilson? Where'd he go? Downward spiral. An all-night place supplied me with a dozen glasses of ale. That a dozen is 12. No one said we were going to get into math here, but so let's just keep it in perspective. He had a dozen glasses of ale, 12 glasses of ale. My writhing nerves were stilled at last. And I put a big question mark at the end of that sentence because I don't know about anybody else, but my nerves were never stilled. Never. I was always one drink away from that point. It was always, I can get there, but I just need one more. Just need one more. That's always the story. It's always one more. My abnormal reaction, wanting more and more and more. A morning paper told me the market had gone to hell again. Well, so had I. And please highlight this next sentence. The market would recover, but I wouldn't. The market would recover shows just how hopeless he's become. Previously, when the market crashed the last time, if you remember, it said that the ego fueled by alcohol, that old fierce determination came back. I'll show them. I'll come back. He doesn't have the will and the ability to do that anymore. The fight is gone. That was a hard, oh, I'm sorry. Well, so the market would recover, but I wouldn't. That was a hard thought. Should I kill myself? No, not now. Not ruling out the possibility, just not now. Then a mental fog settled down. Anyone know about that? Identify with that alcoholic depression that sets in, that doom, that feeling of filled with remorse and filled with horror, hopelessness. Our brain is racing uncontrollably, and all we could feel is a sense of impending calamity and doom. That's what this mental fog is, this alcoholic depression. But we got a solution to that. We got an answer for it. Gin would fix that. That'll fix anything. 2 bottles, and now we're drinking for the worst reason of all. Please highlight and underline that last word, oblivion. We're not drinking for fun. There's no fun in the darkness. We're not drinking to function. There's no functioning in the darkness. We're drinking for the sickest reason of all, blackout objective drinking. All I cared about was getting as deep inside and as far away from everything, especially me. I couldn't stand being anywhere near me. And my solution was always in that bottle, was always in that powder, was always in that pill. It was always in something else that I needed to put in me to get away from me. Sickest reason of all, drinking for oblivion. I'm going to stop there.